Appreciate y'all being here this morning. This is the second Leadership Cafe. And if you were here last month, you know that this was kind of a brainchild of mine for a couple of years now, born out of my PhD experience, which was in leadership studies. And the one thing that we didn't do in the program was argue about theories. We just didn't talk about things as if they were maybe not concrete truth. And so that's one of the things that we're going to do today. I'm going to present to you a theory, just a line of thinking about leadership, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Hopefully you're going to talk around your tables. We're going to kick this thing around because I may or may not even like the theory that I'm presenting. Now, next month, I'm going to do a plug now and a plug later. You don't want to miss next month. Next month, we're going to talk about charismatic leadership and narcissistic leadership, and that's what I did my dissertation on. And I'm just saying with current events, we may want to talk about narcissism. So next month, at the end of October, you'll see it on our website. Some of you have already signed up for that. You're going to want to be here for that. But today we're going to talk about trait theory. But before we get to the actual theory, I want to remind you of two things. And these are kind of ground rules for as we go through this thing. First is think critically. Really take this thing out for a walk and see where are the merits? Where does it fall short? What does it do well? How is it going to help me? How is it not going to help me? Everybody in here comes from a little bit different circumstances and context. Some of us are pastors. Some of us work in the nonprofit. Some of us are for-profit. Whatever it is that your context, leadership is going to look a little bit different. So think critically about what we're going to talk about today. And then, again, take something home with you. Help this, let this help you build your own leadership capacity. And as we go through this, ask questions that will help you in your context, okay? We will figure this whole thing out together. The other thing is, some of you come from really diverse backgrounds. Bring that to the discussion. When we throw things out there and when we talk about different issues around the room, say, hey, from my context, whether it's military, law enforcement, some of you are pastors and been pastors your whole lives. Bring all that to the discussion and let's help each other build our capacity. As we talked about before, leadership comes from a lot of different areas. Now, it's really only been studied since the beginning of the 1900s. And at the beginning of the 1900s, everybody that approached leadership came at it with the intention of finding what are the key traits, what are the key characteristics that we see in good leaders that we can then replicate amongst everybody else. We want to make everybody good leaders. And at the beginning of the 1900s, the definition of leadership was getting people to do what you want them to do. Okay? Now, some of you still hold to that definition of leadership. I won't ask you to raise your hands, and that's okay. But that's how for 30 or 40 years, that's how everybody thought about leadership. How do we get people to do what we want them to do? And a lot of leadership studies were done in the military context. Remember, you have the First World War at the beginning of the 1900s, you have the Second World War in the middle, and it was still in this context of, if I jump out of a trench, how do I get these guys, and at that time leadership was basically a male-dominated field, how do I get these men to jump out of the trench with me? Some people were saying, well, how do I as a general, when I'm not in the trenches, look down to guys and say, now I want you to go out and take that hill, and by the way, I will not be with you, and I will not be anywhere near you. So how do we do that? And then as leadership evolved, we started looking past the actual leader, and we started looking at, okay, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a bargaining agreement between a leader and a follower. Sometimes you'll hear me say the word subordinate. Sometimes it is a negotiation in that relationship. And so leadership theorists started to look at that. And then they started to look at context. Well, maybe leadership can only be done certain ways in certain contexts. Okay? And so you have contingency theories that show up. And then you have situational leadership that shows up. And then you have this idea that what we really need to do is do some really good leadership development and build up a bunch of supermen. And that's why I have the picture of Superman up here. Because Superman had some innate qualities that we would look at as far as traits, but it was really what Superman could do that made him Superman, right? Leaping tall buildings and stopping bullets with hands and that kind of thing. So how do we teach skills and competencies to leaders in order to, you guessed it, get people to do what they want them to do. Okay, so as leadership theory evolved, we have a bunch of different takes on it. Now we kind of have about 100 years of leadership research behind this, and it is actual research. It came very late to the field of academia, but leadership theorists have been going strong for really the last 50 years. And you have, on one side of the aisle, you have leadership theorists, academics, that are saying in a laboratory setting or in a focus group setting, this is what leadership looks like. And then you have other guys walking around like John Maxwell up here or Bill Hybels or others who I call axiomatic leaders who are if you've ever heard John Maxwell speak, he speaks in tweets and in bumper stickers, and they're all good. They all sound like Hallmark cards, right, for leaders. And I don't know how you train yourself to speak like that, but he's been doing this a long time. And so you have academics over here, and you have the axiomatic leaders over here saying, on the ground, in the trenches, in my organization, in my church, leadership is walking slowly through a room, that kind of thing. And so what we're going to do today is a little bit of bouncing between the two. Those two sides of the aisle don't always argue with each other. The academics don't always like what the bumper stickers say about leadership. It's usually too clean and simple and easy to remember for an academic. The axiomatic guys don't like the theorists and the academics because it's really, really long. Okay? Most of those leadership papers and articles are really, really long. The best leadership book that I know of, especially for pastors, but for leaders in all different walks of life, is called Reframing Organizations. And I would give it away if I had the opportunity, but it's 450 pages long. And it's a really easy read, but once you see the size of it, nobody believes that it's a really easy read. And so I tell pastors all the time, this is the book you want. And they're like, yeah, but Bill Hybels' book was like this thick last time, so I'm going to do that one instead. So that's kind of how this whole Leadership Cafe came about. I want to play in the middle there. I want to take some from the academics and some from the axiomatics on the other side, smash them together, and see what we get. All right, now, as you can tell, I'm already losing my voice, which is great because I only have to teach for another 4.5 hours today. Not all of that is you, so don't worry. You read it correctly, 10 to noon. But I'm going to start a discussion here, and it is this is one of the fights that you get into when you do a PhD in leadership. We'll talk about whether or not Hitler was a good leader later on. That's usually like first day PhD leadership argument. The professor will stand up and say, was Hitler a good leader? And then he will sit down and sip his coffee while students argue amongst themselves for like 3 hours. Then class will be dismissed and you never get any resolution to it. This is the second question. Leaders are born or leaders are built, meaning leaders can be trained, can be developed. Leaders can learn. And so I'm going to ask you, what side of this do you fall on? Now, right now, everybody's basically around tables. So right now, amongst yourselves, now, pastors, when you introduce yourselves, we're talking name, not name, church history, don't do any of that. Okay, so that was just for you pastors, and you know why I'm doing that. All right, so real quickly around your table, give your name, and then talk about this for like 3 minutes, and we'll come back together and talk about it as a room. All right, let's come back together and see where we're at. Leaders are born or leaders are built. Okay, so we will start with you next time. Okay, so I don't want you to think you got your tables permanently off the hook, but we're going to start over here right now. Okay, leaders are born or leaders are built?
Which table?
Oh, sorry, back table. We'll come to you right after that.
Well, we kicked around the question, and the consensus was both, but my personal answer was leaders are built, but influence is born.
Okay, all right. Leaders are built, but influence is born. All right, nice. All right, this table right here. What do you all think? Leaders are born or built? And as good leaders, everybody's pointing a finger saying, you talk. So, you said yes. You said yes. Okay, all right.
But my personal belief is they're built by their environment, what they learn through the environment, what they learn through their experiences and through their academics.
Okay. So it's the situation and the context that makes somebody a leader.
I think so. I think they're born with gifts, talents, but I think to become leaders, it takes development of one form or the other.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Let's say we're here. Here go all the leaders. Here go the leaders.
We've stepped back already.
I think the consensus of the table is that we talked about both, but more likely we're looking at their build.
Built. Okay. Any particular reason that you cited there, or just?
I think we talk about born. I mean, we had some different attitudes about born in the right family, where leadership was either a business or something like that, but where you're trusted into, leadership and expected to take over something. But mentoring is part of most people's lives who are going to be leaders. And I think being built means that somebody sees something in you that you may not see in yourself.
Okay.
And we said leaders are built because our leader told us that.
There is a whole group of theories that come from the premise that you just said, where leaders are born into families, and you said leadership is the business, but there's a whole group of leadership theories that say leaders are more naturally developed or more naturally born when their parents are good leaders.
Don't personality traits have something to do with that too?
Sure. Yeah, oh, don't worry. We're going to mess with that a lot today, so don't worry. There's lots of thread to be pulled there, okay? Come in here.
We talked about both.
Okay.
And, kind of the bottom line is, what are the results?
Okay. He who gets it done is a leader. Okay. All right. That's pretty solid. That's 50 years of leadership theory summed up in one statement right there. Yep. All right. Coming over here.
I think we decided that they're born and then they have to be built. I mean, that it's both, but starting with innate traits or characteristics that are refined through the process of training.
Okay. Nice. This table here. Paris, you've been elected.
Yeah, I've been elected. We agreed on both ends. There are leaders who are born with just innate qualities to lead and to be leaders, but also all leaders are also built. They may not have the innate ability out of the womb, but they can learn it and be trained in it and be proficient in it.
Okay. So that was very nice. So this whole idea of leaders are born, that there are certain people that have certain traits that other people don't have. If you pull that thread long enough and if you chase that theory long enough, what are some consequences of that line of thinking, that leaders are born? If I just stay on the top line there and say, you know what? No leaders are really built. If you show me a leader, even if you tell me that he's a developed leader, I'll show you a leader who is born with some certain traits that other people don't have. What are some implications of that? What do you think?
All men are not created equal.
Yeah, just for one, right?
Right. And if you're not born into royalty, then you'll never be a leader.
You're not born into royalty, like leadership royalty or actual royalty?
Well, actual royalty, or you don't have a certain family background or whatever it is, you're never going to be a leader.
Yeah, and I only ask that because for a long time, leadership theorists only studied very privileged classes, like royalty, like the upper echelons of military, civic leaders, religious leaders to some degree. Those were the main groups of people that got studied because it was assumed that if you were a leader, you were going to either be born into that or you were going to end up there one way or the other. So, okay, anything else that comes with this idea of leaders are born?
Social engineering. I mean, if you can isolate it, that this is a born thing, then you genetically alter. It's far-fetched, but
it's not that far-fetched.
No.
And especially in this day and age, as we're talking about, like you said, social engineering, if there was a trait, right, or maybe a combination of trait, or there was a leadership gene, right, what would people stop at to get that gene? Probably nothing, right? If there was something that clearly set apart people from other people, then that would be something worth having, right? So, okay, what else? Yes, sir.
I think another implication is the oppression that can come from that. So thinking in certain cultures where if you're born in a certain class, you're always going to stay down there, whereas those who are born in the upper class, the way to step there is to keep these people down there and not ever elevate them, you know.
Yeah, and absolutely, and this touches on something that the early leadership theorists hit on as well, was by focusing on kind of the upper levels of the caste system, whether it's the actual caste system or a kind of pseudo caste system. It was this idea that we equate leadership with achievement, or leadership with privilege, or leadership with accomplishment. Is there any danger in that line of thinking, equating leadership with these other things? What is the danger of that line of thinking? It doesn't always happen, but it could.
Well, I think he just mentioned one of
It definitely oppresses others, for sure.
others. And I also think you lose potential as a group. For instance, even in the lower caste system, there were leaders of that group,
Sure.
just as there were overall leaders of the whole, say, country or nation. But wherever you're born, there's an influence, I think, by your environment that presses and forms you into certain things based on your personality. Some people, when they're pressed and formed, they give up. Other people fight back, and therefore leaders rise out of that fight.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there's also a leadership theory called leader emergence. And it's this idea of, in a group setting where the table is basically open and level, who rises to a leadership position. Now, they study leadership emergent not in mass movements, but in settings just like this. Like if we were doing if that was a suspiciously big mirror on the wall instead of a whiteboard, there would be scientists on the other side studying each one of these groups saying, okay, nobody was designated as a leader or a spokesman, but who rose to the challenge? Who was it that everybody started pointing at to say, you talk, you know? And what was it about that person who was pointed at that maybe set them apart from the other people? All of that goes into leadership emergence. And the reason that theory was born was because of movements just like what you're talking about. Leadership isn't always done from the top down, right? So in instances where leadership comes through a grassroots effort, what was it about that person that made that person a leader when no one said to them, you are our leader? You know, how did that person emerge? And so was that person born with leadership traits and was just stuck in a lower environment until the situations caused that person to rise? Or, you know, in the whole divine providence thing, was it always supposed to be that way? We knew he was going to be a leader, thus he has the innate traits. Forget about the circumstance or the context. That person was always going to be a leader. So there's a lot there. Andrew, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say the inherent danger for those that feel that they're the born is the narcissism that you're talking about, which leads to higher view of self, lower view of others who are not born, and really an inability to be humble and say, I still need to learn, I still need to be built and trained. So if you've arrived, then there's no more bettering of self for that individual, which is really prominent.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely there. And last month we talked about the models of servant leadership and biblical servant leadership. And by the way, if you're interested in the video, it's posted on the Leadership Cafe site, so it's ready. But the idea that Andrew's talking about, if you already feel like you should sit at the head table, for one, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And two, what is your motivation to bring someone to the head table with you? Because you have already formed in your mind, well, if they were going to be at the head table, they'd already be at the head table. But clearly, I'm better than them, and so they're not, right? So it's very easy to go down that road. Did you have something?
Well, I was going to say, over my years of serving children, even children in the classroom, I was at the gym for 10 years. No matter how I divided the groups in the classroom setting, no matter the age, the grade, he always came out with this theory of the emergence leadership. Always, somehow, some way, no matter how you cut it, out of that group, a leader will arise. And so I would say it's part that you're born with. It's a trait, but also, of course, you gotta build that and develop that over time.
Sure.
But it does happen. I observe it over years, and it does happen. No matter how you divide the group, a leader will emerge eventually.
Yeah. Well, and now let's flip. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, what's interesting about that context is that you, like you were talking about, you put us in this setting, right? You look at us, the leader emerges out of the classroom setting or whatever. But you take that same group of kids and you put them in a different context, a different leader is going to emerge. And so it's all about the...
Possibly. There are academics that would argue with you until they're blue in the face. They would say context matters a little bit, like it may frame the words that they use or the methods of leadership, but they would say in a classroom setting or in a wartime setting or in a fire drill setting, the same, using kids again, the same kid will probably bubble to the top. Now, there are, for every academic that would argue about that, there are 3 on the other side that say, no, context matters a lot, situation matters a lot.
I know some axiom leadership that would say you take a kid in the classroom, you rise to the top, you take them out in the woods, right?
Yeah.
And that kid's going to fold very quickly.
Sure.
You put them on a football field, they'll fold.
Sure.
So in different contexts, different kids will emerge in different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How many times have we heard about father-son leadership and them being compared, saying, "Oh, well, he's not as good as his dad," or his dad, he's much better than his father. So that's, I think, the leaders are born to be a recipe for disaster.
It certainly can be. Now, let's talk about the potential disasters that are down here with leaders are built, okay? Because part of the fun of this is kicking around both sides of the issue. So if I say to you, there's all kinds of danger fraught with this idea that leaders are built, what might be a potential disaster waiting in those particular weeds?
I think, our pastor says anything with more than one head is a freak. So, and what he's talking about is that on some level you have to have leadership. So it can't just be, 5,000 people, everyone, has equal voice and opinion. And it's not that anyone's opinion is less or greater, but it's that God's appointed leaders to lead and for people to follow. And so even when Jesus, he was the leader, he had followers, and it's not that they were less than, but they knew their role. And so I think if you take it to the extreme of all leaders are built, then you can pour hours and hours into trying to develop every single person, but God might not have wired them in a way to lead like someone else can, and they might be better followers to execute as opposed to trying to be the visionary or whatever. So I think that's one of the pitfalls potentially.
Sure, yeah.
There's a danger of trying to stick a square peg in a round hole. Some people just aren't cut out to lead. They're much better in the servant role or something else.
Sure.
But if you think, well, we're going to build this guy, right? It can pose a problem.
And I think it goes back to context too.
Sure.
It's what context that person is being built in. Because I work with special ed kids, and what you might think one person would lead in, they don't. So just the context, I think, is going to change depending on what you need from them as far as leadership.
Yeah, because one of the benefits on this side of the equation, the leaders are built, is that it gets you out of this kind of potentially false problem of some people just aren't cut out to lead. That may be true in a particular circumstance.
Yes.
And it may not be true in other circumstances. And it may be that some people, and we're going to talk about personality styles in a little bit, it may be that certain personalities lead in different ways, right? There's a temptation when you talk about leadership to equate it to a certain kind of behavior. You think of someone who is out front in a crowd, or you think of someone who is leading a group to, from point A to point B, or leading a meeting or whatever it is. But leadership takes a lot of different forms. And if you accept that premise that leadership takes a lot of different forms, it actually gives a lot of credence to this side of the equation, but it doesn't necessarily minimize what you were saying earlier about some people have a calling, right? Or some people have a spiritual gift of leadership, and so we can't go too far down that road and minimize and make the playing field completely level. But there are issues on the other side of things. Anything else that comes along with this leaders are built?
Yeah, I have a comment. I think there is a level, as far as the kingdom of God, there's a level where the playing field is level, and that is we've all been called to disciple at least one other. And so that's like the flat ground is there.
Mm-hmm.
So we're leaders on that aspect. Every single one of us, even the youngest of us who's saved, is called to disciple at least another. But I think the danger in leaders are built is, trying to, like we have the standardized testing, the danger of it is trying to test the proficiency of an elephant by telling him to climb a tree.
Right.
And telling him, well, since you can't climb the tree, you're never going to be successful in life. Well, he's an elephant. Test him in what elephants can do, and then see how good of an elephant's going to be. So I think that the danger in leaders can build is saying you have to be proficient in the way Nielsen Cole leads, or the way that Journey Church leads theirs. You have to be proficient in that, otherwise you're not going to be a leader. And so I think it's finding the type of style that individual leads.
Sure.
He may be a life leader. Jesus led through telling stories. He may be that type of, it's just different types. And I think if you find the way that individual is proficient in and then coach him or her that way, then the leader can be built.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's all kinds of stuff that goes into this. And I think about it like running. Now, I love this picture. This is taken from the Olympics. This is Usain Bolt. This is one of the qualifying rounds, it's not the medal race. And this Canadian racer over here who eventually got the bronze, everybody was kind of taking it easy, especially Usain Bolt. Not the Canadian racer. The Canadian made it a race at the end, and that's what Usain is laughing at and pointing at him. But I think of leadership as running a race because, if you line everybody up at the same starting point, let's say a 100-yard dash, some people are going to run it faster than others. You put that same group of people up and you give them all the same coaching, you gave them all the same nutrition, you gave them all the same dynamics, some people are going to be naturally faster than others. Now, let's say that you have some people that you're going to move up to, they're only going to run an 80-yard race, okay? These people are really, really fast, but we're going to put them at the 80 yards and we're going to keep others at the 100-yard. There are people at the 100 that are going to catch and surpass those that started with a 20-yard head start because these people are naturally faster. But everybody can be coached to learn to run better. Usually you hear the axiom, speed can't be taught, but speed can be coached. You can have someone who is naturally fast and someone who is sort of fast. If you leave the naturally fast person alone and someone who is sort of fast and you coach and you give them nutrition and they work out or whatever, they will be as fast as this person, okay? And so I think about leadership in terms of speed. There are some people who naturally have gifts to lead. And there are some people that with a little bit of coaching, a little bit of nutrition, a little bit of guidance, they can be excellent leaders as well. Context independent. But just generally speaking, some people are naturally born leaders, right? Now, I haven't yet made any kind of claim that those people are good leaders, right? Some people are fantastic leaders and they just lead doing terrible things, okay? So we haven't yet made a moral claim on leadership, and I'm not going there, but I just don't want us to get ahead of ourselves. So when it comes to trait theory, this is the oldest leadership theory out there as far as a group of theories. The initial question that leadership theorists looked at was, what distinguishes leaders from followers, right? They looked at, and this comes from what they call the great man theory. The great man theory was academics looking around saying, why can't everybody be George Washington? Why can't everybody be Abraham Lincoln? Why can't everybody be Martin Luther King Jr.? What is it about those people that makes them those people? And so they set about trying to find the recipe, right, the traits that make those people leaders. And this leadership theory, as opposed to a lot of others, focuses only on the leader, okay? So this is really mostly in the domain of leaders are born. And so what are they born with? Are they born with an ability to do public speaking? Are they born with an ability to cast vision? Whatever it is, what are they born with? Forget about their leaders, or forget about their followers, and forget about their context. Leaders will be leaders will be leaders. That's kind of the axiom of this theory. It doesn't even focus on behavior, strategies, or actions. Okay? It doesn't say that all leaders will do A, B, or C. This is how a good leader behaves. They're not messing with any of that. They just think if you have a leader and they have a certain group of traits, they will execute leadership however it needs to be best done. Does that make sense? So then this naturally leads to, especially, and in the 80s, a book came out that really that put a new emphasis on trait leadership because they started looking at organizations. They started looking at companies that were doing things really, really well. And then it didn't take them very long to say, well, if those companies are doing really, really well, it must be because they are led in a really, really good way. So what is it about those leaders that makes them lead these organizations to do these wonderful things? That is a really complicated covering for trait theory. And so in the 80s, trait theory comes back because not only did they look at who is leading, they looked at, okay, well now if we can tell who makes a good leader, we can probably also tell who makes a good follower. And so when we hire, if we're hiring a managerial position, we don't want to hire a follower, we want to hire a leader, and vice versa. And so let's really start getting into people's personality, and let's really start trying to make sure that people are slotted where they will best be used according to their personality. And then the last thing is that your personality somewhat determines the kind of work that you will do, the kind of organization that you will do or work in. All of that is generated from your personality. Now, what do you think about that? Are people, based on their personality, more suited for certain kinds of work or certain kinds of organizations?
I don't think so. I think if you leave them room for it, it means that they might approach their work in different ways. But, so I guess in that sense, it needs, yes and no.
Yes and no. He said that definitively. Yes and no. Okay.
I think the danger you get in with that is just like what was said, the round peg in a square hole, is that you see, oh, this person's a D personality, he's the leader. This person's a number cruncher. He can't be a leader, so he must be the number cruncher or the person. And so the committee or the group never sees that person as being a leader, and therefore never gets the authority or the ability to try to lead. I think that's the danger you have when you start saying this person is paid for this position or this job.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it goes just the opposite too. I was thinking of King Saul when you were talking about that great man theory. Mm-hmm. He was tall, he was handsome, he's the leader, right?
Right.
But was he? I mean, was he really a leader? He was chosen, but why? I think we do that sometimes when we look at politicians. Are they tall?
Hypothetically, of course.
Yeah, hypothetically. Are they tall? Are they good looking? I mean, do I like their personality?
Sure.
And that doesn't necessarily make you a good leader. It might put you in a position to be selected, or like the Bible said, heads and shoulders above the others, so you're more visible than the others, but only I think time will tell.
We're going to come to it, but there's a whole other theory called implicit leadership theory. And what that is people are determined to be leaders because followers say, that guy looks like a leader. I mean, seriously. And so they will, and it's frequently applied to politicians.
And they become leaders, but not necessarily good leaders.
Right, and sometimes it works out, right? The followers had a pretty good beat on things, and they're like, that person's a leader, so we'll put them in a leadership position. And then if they succeed, they're like, see, we were right. And they give them kind of more authority. And if that person fails, then they're like, Yeah, okay, we messed that one up. So we're going to rein that person in. There's a whole bunch of people out there that really look at why is it that people choose certain people for and King Saul is a great example, right? Bible says he was a head taller than everybody else. Everybody was literally looking up to him.
But you look at David, he was a more horrible man than Saul.
Right, and then you come back.
What he did was horrible.
Well, but we're shades of gray as far as horrible, right? But but David usually is looked at it as the opposite, right? He was out in the fields, nobody thought about him, that kind of thing. He didn't look like a leader. But you get all of that throughout history. You have crowds of people saying, we're pretty sure that person's a leader based on either how they look, how they speak, combination of the two, whatever. Yeah, Paris?
I think traits do play somewhat of a role. I'll speak from my own experience. When I was training sales managers for the company I used to work for, we looked for certain traits that would make them a successful salesperson. And if you didn't have it, you just didn't have it. And we tried, and there was a process to try to teach it to them. And if it wasn't picked up, it just wasn't picked up.
Sure.
And even in the Bible, Paul would tell Timothy, if someone wants to be a deacon or a bishop, they have to have these things. They have to treat their wife well, or they have to lead their kids well. They have to be well known in the community, which I guess you can argue are those traits or are those skill sets or whatever. Behaviors or whatever. But needless to say, there are things that someone would look for if you want a certain leadership job or role. You would have to embody certain traits or personalities.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, this especially this last sentence about certain people are good at certain kinds of work makes me very uncomfortable. Like, I just don't like the idea of pigeonholing, like to your example, well, that guy's a numbers guy, so he can't be this. And so I'm going to park that statement right there. I also have seen, kind of like what Paris is talking about, I've seen certain kind of people be really, really bad at certain kinds of work, and everybody should have seen it coming, right? Like, you can't work with special needs kids if you have a short fuse. Right? And so if they're like, well, but, they're really intelligent, they speak really well, they do great lesson plans, but you put them in an environment like that, and 30 seconds later, that person is yelling at a special needs kid. They should not have been in there, right? So you have, and you have, predisposition to anger as a trait, saying, okay, we really should have seen that in the interview, right? We should have weeded that person out. If you panic easily, you shouldn't drive an ambulance, It's the same kind of principle, right? You just don't want that person in charge when everybody else is freaking out. So on the one hand, it's a little easier to feel good about when you're like, well, he's a numbers guy, but he's a good COO, but could he be a CEO? But it's a little different when you're like, that guy Twitch is walking up the stairs. We do not want him driving an ambulance. This is a bad move. And so there's a lot to this, though, because as you start talking about people's personality, you're talking about things that they can't control, right? So if I look at you and say, you were not born to do this kind of work, somebody says that to me, my head explodes. I kind of have that now. They may be right, but my head will still explode. I just don't like being told what I can't do. I'm a firstborn. So as leadership theorists start looking at this, they start making lists, right? I told you last time that leadership theory is basically lists and then boxes and arrows, okay? I don't have any boxes and arrows this time, but I got lists. Now, in 1948, a guy named Stockdale did a survey of 124 leadership studies. And he was looking for the magic recipe. He was looking for what made a leader a good leader. And he came up with these things. So he looked at all these different studies and said, these are the traits that are in common across all of these studies. Now this is 1948. So he comes up with things like intelligence, insight, alertness, and other things. And then you have sociability, which is down in the last thing. This is kind of the social intelligence, a little different than emotional intelligence. This is people know how to behave in public kind of thing. Now, and then people have been doing this ever since, right? Mann came along in 1959 and did a different list. And so then Stockdale came back in 1974 and he said, okay, I've been looking at studies since my last published study up until now. Now I've got 163 studies and I've added a few traits to my list of the magic recipe. And so he came up with 10 of these traits. Well, then you have a bunch of people that are doing this, but a study in 1991, Kirkpatrick and Locke said, here's a quote, "It is unequivocally clear that leaders are not like other people." Okay? So they just came to this saying, we know there's something different about these people. We just can't quite put our finger on it. Well, this is their attempt to put a finger on it. Okay? And so they said cognitive ability, same as basically intelligence, motivation, integrity, confidence, drive, and task knowledge. Now, one of the things that they added in that was that task knowledge. So notice there that they had almost all innate traits, and then they kind of stuck that last one in there to say, and they know how to do their job, right? So there's nothing in the gene code that says you know how to do your job. But they said you just can't really conceptualize leadership without knowing how to do your job or knowing how to do something well. And so then you have another list that was done in 2004. I'm telling you, these lists come out all the time. This list comes along and it starts going into some of the really deep personality stuff when it talks about extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It added emotional intelligence, and we're going to talk more about that. But I wanted to put this up here not to say you should really memorize all these lists. I'm not doing that. But just to say, yeah, you got it, good. You with the photographic memory, you're going to be great at this. But just to kind of illustrate that there are, since 1948, some commonalities, right? Most people look at leaders and say they are intelligent or they have the ability to process information well, that cognitive ability. In the 40s and 50s, they would not have called it cognitive ability. They would have just said that person's intelligent. You see persistence up there quite a bit. You see responsibility up there a few times. So you see some similarities. But as we learn more about how people think and how people process information, we start to get a little bit deeper into what does personality look like. So before we get there, let's talk about, generally, when we look at trait theory, this is how it is reviewed as far as what the academics think. The strengths are, yes, it definitely fits what we naturally think, right? And everybody in here, for the most part, that has spoken, has kind of alluded to this idea that, well, that person's a leader, that person's not. Even if it's, well, they were raised in a context and they were developed or whatever, there was some magic line that they crossed and they went from being a follower to a leader. So this theory kind of fits what we want to think anyway. Again, it's the oldest theory out there and it's very easily measured, right? You put a personality inventory in front of somebody, you have them fill it out and say, okay, you either are, matching our recipe of what we think a leader should be, or you're not, okay? Very cut and dry. Now, the cut and dry part of it is one of its failures and one of its weaknesses also. Because what if somebody gets missed, right? What if their personality doesn't cleanly line up with what some scientist says you have to have? That happens all the time. There are books out there that say you can't be a unless you have a certain personality style. I am not a believer in that. UBA as an organization is not a believer in that. But those books come out all the time. You cannot, if you don't have a certain Myers-Briggs category, and we'll talk about that in a second, that means you don't have the spiritual gift of leadership. That's quite a leap in my realm of thinking. But, so the other thing is, and I showed you this before, do you see really any agreement between all these lists? And there were a billion that I could have put up there that I didn't. The problem with this theory is nobody's found the secret sauce recipe, right? Nobody knows what's actually in the recipe that makes someone a good leader. We have hints at it, we have theories, we have guesses, but nobody's really found it. So there's no definitive list. Also, and I think this is interesting, these lists can be colored by your interpretations of not just personality, but also context, right? How do you measure drive? How do you measure motivation? Well, that person gets up in the morning and they're a morning person, so they must have drive. this person's not a morning person, so they don't have drive, right? Because we've been to leadership conferences, right, that say, as a leader, I don't need to set my alarm clock, right? I just get up and I'm passionate about what I do, and man, I hit the ground running. And my first thought when I heard that was, I have never been so quickly dismissed as a potential leader in my life because I'm not a morning person, right? When my wife and I had kids, our first son was born, and I told my wife, I said, now, we hear these things about when parents have kids that the sound of their cry will wake them up. I'm not a big believer in that, okay? My child could be sleeping next to me and I may not wake up, okay? It doesn't mean I don't love my child. It just means I don't do mornings, okay? So, turns out all kids do mornings. That should have been in the manual for kids, but that's a whole other leadership cafe. The other thing that this looks at or fails to look at is traits related to outcomes, right? Somebody talked about it earlier. Well, he who gets it done is a leader. So what are the outcomes that determine whether or not someone is a leader? What are the things that someone has to do in order to be considered high achievement, which is a term that you come across a lot in the leadership literature. That person's high achievement. No one really knows. So what we're going to do is look at this quote, and I'm going to have you kick this around at your table. The trait approach suggests that organizations will work better if people in managerial positions have designated leadership profiles. Okay? Is this true? Now, also, what do we think about this? The trait approach suggests that organizations will work better if people in managerial positions have designated leadership profiles, which means, in essence, do you want to work for a company that has already thought ahead and said, we want this kind of person to be in leadership?
No.
No, why?
Because the biggest complaint in the workplace is, and as a manager, I have had employees say, we had a company that was purchased by another company, we were acquired. All of a sudden, the culture was starting to change, and the employees were feeling like, oh, we're being pigeonholed now. Okay. We are being confined, our duties are being, we just have to run this one lane. We can't jump lanes like we used to. And the staff just started leaving.
Okay. So staff might feel pigeonholed. Okay.
Well, I am more than the sum of my profile.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you don't want that brought into consideration.
Not saying it couldn't be brought into consideration, but man, there's a whole lot more to me than just what my test scores reveal.
Sure. Sure. I had somebody take a personality profile one time, and they said, now go easy, I don't test well. And I was like, that's either an indictment on your own personality or you don't really understand what we're doing here. So, but yeah, but I think a lot of people feel that way, right? Don't confine me to what the numbers of the letters, say. What else?
I'm not sure I understand your question, but if we're looking at people who choose leaders, it's usually done top down rather than bottom up.
Sure.
But the people that they're going to be leading are at the bottom, and they know what they need usually better than the top. But that's why I wouldn't buy into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did y'all see the article in Sunday's paper, the front page actually, about Chandler Forest Baptist Church? Mm-hmm. And so they did the story on Pastor Fleming, and the thing that he said when he was interviewed for the position, what he told the committee was, this is things I'm going to do. I'm already decided ahead of time, I'm not going to fit in this profile. That's what you want me. So, and now he's able to really change the dynamics of the church because of the community they live around in.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody else?
Yeah, a lot of companies now are telling you to go online to apply for a job. and it's more of a personality profile type of
Sure.
questionnaire that they're asking. And I know certain folks that probably don't test well, like you just said.
Right.
And they wouldn't come through as the type that they need for the company, when in reality they need that type of company. So maybe something like this, it's just like you were saying, you know, it's a hit and miss type of situation, I think.
Yeah, and I think, you know, something that somebody kind of hinted at was, it depends on the kind of work, right? There are certain personality styles that probably don't line up very well with first responders, whether it's police, fire, medical, whatever. And there are other personality styles that, if you work in ministry or you're a chaplain or whatever else, you know, that probably don't line up well as a first responder, but may line up very well as a pastor or chaplain, because there are different skills involved and different behaviors that are necessary. And then sometimes you find people that can do both. And so the people that do both are like, you know, don't categorize me by my letters. And then other people who are like, yeah, I don't like the sight of blood. You know, I panic easily. You know, well, we should have put that question on the test. We could have saved each other a lot of time. So, and the other thing is, as we move through this kind of whole line of thinking, this whole trait theory has given a bunch of theories kind of legs. And so we're going to talk about the offshoots that come from this theory. And I'm going to summarize them here, but basically this has given everybody an opportunity to say, well, what really is personality? You know, let's really talk about that. And so psychologists get together and they have come up with basically what the, sorry, that skipped a little fast there. Psychologists in the literature basically agree that personality is made up of some combination of what they call the big five, okay? And very rarely do you have academics that get around a label as easy to remember as the big five. So when this happens, it means everybody has just taken it for granted and moved on. Now, I ranked these in the order that they usually correlate to leadership, however leadership is being measured, okay? So when you read remember what the academics say, there's always another side, but what the academics say as far as what correlates to leadership, they always start with extroversion, okay? Now extroversion is a little bit different than extroverted, and we're going to talk about that in a second, okay? But extroversion is someone who is sociable, someone who's energetic, right? This whole, you know, feet hit the floor in the morning and bam, they're after it, you know? This is extroversion. Conscientiousness also ranks very high as far as how it correlates to leadership, and this is the person who is organized, decisive, controlled, very methodical, right? That's a highly conscientious person. Openness is the third, and this is someone who is flexible, creative, curious, likes to try new things, likes to go different ways to and from work, doesn't really have a favorite restaurant, you know, that kind of person, very open. Now, neuroticism it correlates with leadership, but you have to have low neuroticism. So if you are a high neurotic, okay, if you are highly neurotic, it means that everything affects you emotionally, okay? It means that you probably have higher highs than most people and lower lows than most people. Some people would say emotionally unstable. That makes it sound like, you know, mentally imbalanced. That's not what we're talking about, okay? If you are a high neurotic, it means that you wear your emotions on the sleeve. Everything affects you. You're a terrible poker player, you know, because you are an easy read, you know. My son's 5. He's learning to play card games right now. We play a lot of Go Fish. It's a blast because he pulls open a card and immediately his face changes. It either lights up or it doesn't. And I'm like, okay, we'll talk about that later, you know. But if you are a high neurotic, everything emotionally affects you. And so when it correlates to leadership, not everything can emotionally affect you. Why? I mean, just real quickly, why not? If you're a leader, why can't you take everything?
Objectivity.
There is some objectivity or a need for objectivity as a leader, sure. But for every leader, there is a what? Follower. There's a follower, and then there's also a naysayer. right? For every leader, the follower agrees with the leader. Then there's somebody who is, not happy with the leader. Well, if you are someone who takes everything in emotionally, you're not going to do well in an environment that has constant naysayers. Okay? Now, I say that, remember, we're going to talk about narcissism next month, but I say that to say it doesn't mean that you can't hear what the naysayers say. It means that as far as what the academics say correlates to leadership, you can hear what the critics say, it's not going to keep you up at night. Or you're not going to immediately start questioning your calling. Or you are not going to automatically start thinking, man, I am a disaster of a person. That person's right. I mean, I am miserable. That person is highly neurotic if they're taking all that in, okay? And then the last one is agreeableness. Now, agreeableness is someone who is accepting, conforming, and nurturing. When we talk about narcissists next month, we're going to talk about how narcissists, as far as the big five, they're called disagreeable extroverts, okay? Narcissists are disagreeable extroverts, meaning narcissists are not accepting, they are not conforming, they are not people pleasers, they are not nurturing. You don't go to a narcissist to feel better about yourself, okay? But they are sociable. Narcissists make very good first impressions. They are very good in front of a crowd. I don't know what we could possibly draw from in this current environment that would support what I'm saying, but you might see something over the next coming days about that. So these are called the big five. Now, in addition to the big five, which is based in a lot of psychological theory and people who have tested this over and over again, now you have what people are very familiar with is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI. Now, the Myers-Briggs is a personality inventory that has been used, for 50 years or so. And basically what happened was two women got together and they decided we need a way to take what Carl Jung thought of as personality and he saw in his patients, and we need a way to apply that to people. And specifically, they had the aim of saying, we want to help women access the workforce, and so we want to help people understand their personality better and better understand who to hire. So they came up with the MBTI. Now, how many of you have ever done an MBTI before? You know your initials. Okay. Real quickly, we're going to go through this, and then I'm going to have you tell the people at your table, if you're comfortable with it, what your initials are, and I will lead out in the vulnerability here and tell you what my initials are here too. So extroversion, introversion. This is a scale of where do you get your energy from? Okay, is it invigorating to be in a big group of people, or is it exhausting? I'm an I. Okay, and I'm a pretty high I, which means I can be up in front of people, I can do the public stuff, but it is exhausting. Okay, and I just want to take a nap afterwards. Okay, my pastor is a very high E, and so he loves being around people. He loves being in the thick of stuff. He goes home with more energy from a Sunday service than he had when he got there. Okay, one of my best friends is an E, and he was a classic, like I'd say, hey, Mark, let's go play golf. And I'm an I, and I'm thinking just the two of us, right? And so my high E friend Mark always shows up with two complete strangers, right? Because he can't do anything by himself, and so he brings these people. And so now, as an I, I'm like, this just went from being relaxing to exhausting, because now it's a group of people that I don't know, and it's going to require me to be on, okay? So E or I, I'm a high I. There's also sensing or intuiting. And intuiting, they abbreviate with the N to stay away from all of us introverts. And this is, how do you prefer to gather information? If you are a sensor, it means that you need to see it, touch it, smell it, experience it for yourself. It needs to be concrete, okay? I'm an N, okay? So I'm an intuitor, which means I don't need to necessarily be able to put my hands on it. I'm going to gather information and kind of make sense of things through insight, okay? The Christianese word there is discernment, okay? So not to say one is right or wrong, and that's the same for all of these scales, but you are sometimes more natural and that you prefer to gather your information in a concrete way, or maybe not so much. I'm in the maybe not so much. So I'm an IN so far, Okay? Now, this next one is thinking and feeling. Now, as far as perceiving and gathering information, that's on the second one. What you do with it and how you make decisions is this thinking feeling. Okay? Now, I'm a T. Okay? I prefer to think things through. And so I want to make decisions rationally and as objectively as I possibly can. If you are a feeler, then you're going to go with the flow, how you're feeling at this. It's very subjective. You don't necessarily need things as concrete or as rational. You don't always need an explanation. And so on spec, if you've never done one of these tests, you would think, well, if you're an N, you must also be an F. And that's not true. Okay? In fact, there are so many combinations of this, and people are all over those combinations. Okay? They haven't yet found anybody that didn't fit one of those combinations. So there are people out there that want to intuit how they gather that information, but then they want to make a very rational decision with it. So they would be a T, like myself. So thinking or feeling. Judging versus perceiving. I read something this week that said this dynamic is the cause for more workplace problems than anything else on this slide. Because, and I can illustrate this because I am one of these and my wife is the other. Not to say that we're having problems, but just to say when we disagree with something, it's because of this dynamic. I can promise you. Okay? Now, so I'm going to try and make this as objective as I can, but I'm not good at that. So there are judgers and perceivers. Now, judgers are fairly organized, rigid, make snap decisions. Okay? So a judger would go into a restaurant, look at the menu, scan it, pick 3 things, bam, they're ready to go. 5 minutes, they put the menu down, they're done. A perceiver is the opposite of that. This is someone who is adaptable, spontaneous, curious, creative. And a perceiver will go into a restaurant and look at the entire menu twice. Okay? Now, I've already hinted at I'm a J. Okay? My wife is a perceiver. Now, we can go to the same restaurant every night for a week. Okay? The second night, I will pull up in the parking lot and I will know what I'm ordering. Right? I probably picked the restaurant knowing what I was going to order. I just judged it, snap decision, I'm done. Okay? But my wife is going to read that menu, both sides. Now, in the end, she will probably make a better decision than I will. Okay? Because she has seen the breadth of the options there. It's just that as a J, I wanted to be done with that decision so I could make another one. Okay? So J and P. So when you have people in the workplace who are J's on one side and perceivers on the other, you can see where this might lead to some debate. You go to a staff meeting. Staff, we need to make a decision on this. So here's the issue. What do we all think? A J is thinking, we're going to talk about this, we're going to make a rational decision, we're going to be done with it. A perceiver is thinking, we're going to hear this, we're going to think about it, we may need a break to think about it some more. That's right, we may need to sleep on it.
Pray about it.
That's right. That's right. And then we will come back later and make an informed, solid decision about it, right?
Which we may change our minds about later.
I didn't say he was a perceiver, he did. Okay? Now, I will say this, though. If you are doing like product research, you want a perceiver doing that research for you. Like I will say to my wife, I will say, hey, we need a new, fill in the blank, dishwasher. She will disappear in a hole of the internet because she's going to climb through every rating. She's going to look at every source. She's going to look at how the sources are done. Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's going to spreadsheet that thing, and we will get the best dishwasher. Okay? If I was left in charge of that decision, we would get the one at the first store I went to. Right? And hopefully it's on sale. I'm not making any promises. Okay? But we would have it the first day. That I can promise you. Right? So you see the differences here. I'm not saying one is better than the other. A lot. We'll edit the video a little bit. But so you have thousands of people every year that take this test. Okay? And they get their initials. And so just for a little bit of levity, Ed has already let out here and said that he is a perceiver. Around the table. Oh, he's not. Okay. What type are you? Tell the table and what that means for you in real life. Do you know? Do you not know? How do you know? And what does that look like? You got 3 minutes. Go. All right, let's come back together real quick. I know this can get fun. Some of you are burying your souls. Some of you are ratting out close family members. That's what I did. I got a really good question. First of all, as far as the MBTI is concerned, and this is a terrible slide, but when they look at how the MBTI relates to leadership, the MBTI is not the only personality inventory out there. There are dozens of them. In fact, there's a fun one. If you want one to just absolutely throw away, but you want a fun one, it's called Kingdomality. It's free online. It takes like 30 seconds to do, and it will spit out your profile in a medieval figure type person. I was a Black Knight. Okay, so of course I love that, so I'm like, great, I'm a Black Knight, awesome. But the DISC profile is very popular. There's the Berkman profile. All these profiles kind of hit at an underlying personality. Somebody asked me, can your letters change? Sometimes, but it's rare. The full MBTI inventory is like 200 or 300 questions long. Almost no one that I know has actually taken the real MBTI. Most of us have taken some watered down version of it just to get the initials and get the conversation going. And that's really all I advocate. I put this slide up here to say some people will look at different letters as far as, well, this is what makes a good leader. Well, I think there's always another side to that discussion. And so if you say to me, well, all leaders have to be E's, well, the opposite of someone who's really energizing and really communicative and all that is they tend to just blast you with information. And as someone who is following a leader who does that, that can be difficult. All of these initials, all these letters have pluses and minuses to them. Okay, there's no one right personality to go with, but it's kind of fun to play with. All right. So, and if you ever take a personality inventory, DISC, Berkman, MBTI, whatever you want, and it comes back and you're just like, that is not me at all. I would give you two pieces of advice. One is to take it again in 6 months. The second is to ask 5 of your friends. And now, not you need truth-telling friends, okay? And you know who I'm talking about, right? You don't want any yes people in this discussion. But, just put this in there and go, am I really a thinker? Or am I really a judger? Is that how I make decisions? And if they've ever gone out to eat with you once, they'll tell you. Right? They'll go, oh man, at the restaurant, you just could not order. Good gosh. I mean, we were through the appetizers. Half of us were ordering dessert. You're still trying to figure out what drink you wanted. I mean, okay, well, you're a perceiver, So some of us just don't know because we've never taken the test. And some of us, it's very possible on these tests to be very close, right? Like right in the middle. Right. My thinking feeling dynamic is pretty close between the T and the F. The J and the P, it's not close at all. I mean, I am all J. I even kind of look down on the people who are P's, So, I'm also very high I, okay? Now, I'll tell you, and I was telling Jeff earlier, I took this when I was an interim pastor one time, and my job was to be kind of, herding cats out in front of people all the time, around people all the time. My E score actually went up. And then I took another job shortly thereafter where I wasn't around people at all, and it went right back down to where it should be in the I, okay? And so you can kind of rise to the occasion and tweak the numbers a little bit, but it's very uncommon, and your letters very rarely change. Yes, sir?
What was the name of that one you said online that was for free?
Kingdomality. It's just for fun. Like, don't go into a job interview and go, I'm a Black Knight, hire me. That'd be bad, I'm a friar, that's terrible. No, don't do that. Yes, sir.
For an abridged version of this, people can go to 16personalities.com. That's where I take it for free.
Okay.
And I know what you said. I sent it to my spouse.
Right.
She sent me hers, and we talked about it to clarify, hey, is this how I act and all that.
Yeah. My wife and I have done probably 10 of these. We would do 20 more of them just for fun, And it's 16personalities.com. So you can do that. You can get your initials. Remember, don't judge yourself by these initials. Like some of you really want to be extroverts and you're going to test as an I. That's okay. Even though there are 3 E's to every I, We're small, but we're proud. Okay, so, yes, sir.
It's interesting because in our table, we usually match these traits with our spouses. It's easy because you see contrasts. But then the question is, does this easily translate to a church setting, for example? Are we very intentional in, like Pastor Pani said, that we're forming a team?
Sure.
But are we really very intentional in taking in staff
Yeah.
that could be opposite our traits or?
And would that necessarily be a good thing? You know, like if I'm a total extrovert and a total judger, do I really want to work for someone who is an introvert and a perceiver? Like that person may never come out of their office with a decision. So if it's my job to implement what they decide, now, if I am the introvert and the perceiver and I work for an extrovert and a judger, it can be just as maddening, but in reverse. Because at that point you're like, all they do is make decisions. And all I have to do is execute, execute, execute. And I never get time to really process this and think about this and do the research and do all that. And so in fact, this is where the Berkman really shines, because the Berkman and Thomas Billings, who offices in this building, is a Berkman consultant. And what he does is he looks at people and he looks at how the teams are made up by their personalities and say, okay, be aware when you're coaching this person, this is how they're going to want their information, right? This is how they're going to want their deadlines. Some people are going to say, hey, look, for me, I respond to concrete deadlines. Now, on the one hand, that's good because I respect the deadline, okay? Now, not all perceivers do, but on the flip side of it, it could lead to, hypothetically, in somebody else that's not me, a little bit of procrastination because I respond to deadlines. And so I'm always going deadline, 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 deadline. So if I don't have an imminent deadline, I'm kind of like, I'll do it later. I'll do it when the deadline demands it. So each one of these, it doesn't matter what letter you throw up there, I'll twist it one way or the other, which makes it fun, right? Because we're all people. And so when you're coaching and when you're leading teams and when you're hiring staff and doing all that has to be kind of taken into the mix. Now, there's a book that I put on your handout called Personalities at Work, I think. I lost it. I have Kroger and Thiessen on there. It's in the personality inventory. Type Talk at Work. Thank you. Type Talk at Work is a very good, if you know your initials and you want to see how these initials can not only express themselves in people and personality types, but also how they may relate to other personality types, it's a very good book. There are a lot of books out there, but I would really encourage you, if this is something that you're like, I'm interested, then seek that out.
There's even some good work on this stuff in terms of spiritual formation, based on your personality style from Myers-Briggs as to what kinds of things help you form spiritually.
Yeah, the first week of my PhD studies, we did a whole battery of tests. We did conflict resolution of personality, and we did one that actually asked us, it used the DISC profile, and it asked us questions related to spiritual giftedness. And so on the DISC profile, I'm an SC, and then it said, if you're an SC and you have these gifts, this is the ministry that you may be looking for. So those instruments are out there. If you want more information about that, I can get that to you. A lot of these personality inventories need to be administered and scored by someone who understands what's going on with the test itself. It's very difficult to just find a DISC test just laying around on the street somewhere. You usually have to go to a provider for it. But yeah, if you're interested in that, let me know. I'll load you up with information about this. One of the other things that trait theory has really borne out is this idea of emotional intelligence. And I gave you 3 resources on your handout about emotional intelligence. If you went to the Global Leadership Summit, you heard Dr. Bradbury talk about Emotional Intelligence 2.0. The reason that book is 2.0 is because Daniel Goleman wrote Emotional Intelligence in the 90s. And so Bradbury took his work, augmented it, kind of updated it, and now it's Emotional Intelligence 2.0. It's this idea that not only that you can express emotions, but that you understand what emotions are doing, not only to you, but to other people. Okay? And that you care what it's doing to you and to other people. And that really is one of the differences between someone who has a high emotional intelligence quotient, which they call EIQ, And someone who, for instance, is like a raging narcissist, doesn't care what the other person is feeling, understands perfectly well how to make that person feel something, doesn't care that they are feeling it. Okay, so that's someone that would be low in emotional intelligence. And someone who has a high EIQ not only understands all this stuff about emotions, but also can manage it. Okay? Someone who, let's say, you're in a pressure situation, room bursts into flame, and you have to lead everybody out the door. It's okay to be panicky and scared at that moment. You can't be paralyzed by that fear. Does that make sense? And so someone with emotional intelligence in a variety of circumstances understands, hey, this is going to affect me. I'm going to a funeral or I'm going to a celebration. This is going to affect me in such and such a way. That's going to affect how I treat people in such and such a way. And this is how I may need to moderate that or rein it in, or maybe just, hey, it's a party, I'm going to let that go. So emotional intelligence, there's a ton out there about it, and we don't really have time to pull that, but a lot of the work on emotional intelligence came out of this idea of trait theory. Why are certain people solid rocks? Those people I'm talking about, they are just there. Doesn't matter what's going on around them, they will be there, they will be solid. Now, they may crumble afterwards, right? But when they need to be a rock, they're a rock. So trait theory led directly into emotional intelligence. Okay, the psychodynamic approach. You see this little coffee cup icon. This means we're going to come back to it in a future Leadership Cafe. The psychodynamic approach says, let's look at personality and let's look at how those personalities have predictable effects on followers. Okay, so it's a little bit of emotional intelligence, but it's also saying, okay, I understand that I am a certain personality type. By understanding that I'm a certain personality type and understanding that you are a certain personality type, that means that when I'm trying to lead you, I need to lead in a particular way in order to get the outcome that we both want. Okay? All of that is kind of wrapped up in the psychodynamic approach. This is where a lot of the study on whether or not it's good to be a narcissist comes from. Okay? And you'll see just popular literature, is it bad to be a narcissist? Help me, I work for a narcissist, that kind of thing. General Patton in World War II was a raging narcissist. Okay? And if you ask military historians, they will say, we needed General Patton at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, there were a lot of other times where we did not want General Patton anywhere around. Like anything related to diplomacy, he's like the last guy we wanted. Okay? But in this particular circumstance, the fact that he was a raging narcissist actually worked to his advantage and the advantage of his army to get the job done. The contemporary example everybody runs to is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, according to everybody who has ever talked to him or had a relationship with him, he was a raging narcissist. Okay? But he had a bold vision, and he was unwilling to settle for less than that vision. If you are not, to some degree, a raging narcissist, you won't make that kind of decision, right? Steve Jobs was willing to trample people in personal conversations. He was willing to yell at employees during staff meetings. He may not have been the guy that everybody wanted to work for in the inner circle, and yet he had close friends. He had close relationships. And if you ask a lot of the close relationships, or you read what they have said in materials is, well, that was just Steve being Steve. So what they were doing is they saying, okay, I understand his personality, and I understand my personality, and I understand how his personality is going to affect me, and this is how I'm going to make the best of it. Okay? And so the psychodynamic approach talks about all that. Next month, when we talk about charisma, why some people have that it factor, a lot of that is considered charisma, and we're going to talk about that next month. Implicit leadership theory, we talked about this a little bit earlier. My slides are getting ahead of me. Implicit leadership theory is what we talked about earlier a little bit. It's that process of when people say, I think that person is a leader. Okay? Now, if leadership is the process of being perceived by others as a leader, that slide is brutally mistyped. Sorry about that. If leadership is the process of being perceived as a leader, there's a natural built-in problem with that. And that is, if you all say to me, well, we perceive you as a leader, so please lead us, okay? You have said nothing about my capacity or my skill or even my personality. You have just said, you seem like a good leader, lead us. My primary role as a leader now is not to actually lead you. My primary role as a leader is to manage that perception as a leader. Right? So I just want you to continue to see me as a leader, because as long as you all see me as a leader, I get to be a leader. Does that make sense? So it doesn't always work out that way, but it can lead to some very superficial, some very fake leadership where it becomes about manipulating perceptions than anything else. Now, you see this also in some leadership circumstances where in a grassroots type of effort, somebody says, we need a leader, we're going to call on Ernest. Ernest is going to be our leader. And Ernest leads us, and we get some really good, successful outcomes. What comes along with this theory is us as a group saying, see what a good job Ernest did as a leader? Please, Ernest, have more authority or make more decisions for us. Okay? And as long as he keeps bringing home, right, the victories, then we will keep vesting him with discretion to be a leader. But as soon as he fails, we're not going to just necessarily fire him as a group, but we may pull back the reins a little bit and say, well, okay, you get to make that decision, we're going to make this decision. Okay? And so implicit leadership theory, the reason I mention it is because, for one, it traces directly out of trait leadership. This comes right out of people saying, well, he seems like a leader, let's follow him. But also, just to kind of put a seed in your mind, we all follow different people. Why are you following them? Is it because they seem like a leader? Because they have demonstrated skill as a leader? The first time I heard about this theory, I thought my mind exploded a little bit, because I was like, oh my gosh, I never really thought about whether or not I was following, whether it be pastors or civic leaders or government leaders, whoever it is, because it just seemed like they were, they had the voice, right? You hear, especially in election season, you hear about the presidential voice. He speaks or she speaks like a president should speak. That is a managing of perception. Right? The way someone talks may or may not have any direct correlation to how they lead. And so, implicit leadership theory. One of the other things that has come from trait theory is this idea of cultural leadership. Now again, coffee cup icon, in a future leadership cafe, we're going to talk about cultural leadership, because there's just too much here to really lean into. I gave you a resource on your handout if you're interested about cultural leadership. There are a couple of really good books out. One is pretty recent. One is an ongoing study in 62 different countries around the world. It has involved thousands and thousands of interviews among managers trying to figure out how different countries conceptualize leadership. And so I'm going to park all that over here and also say, while they were doing that, some of the guys that were conducting that study are old trait theory guys. And so they wanted to know, is there any such thing as a universally accepted leadership trait? Is there any kind of trait that all cultures, according to our interviews, and this is, the margin of error is very small on this, okay? They didn't just ask 5 people in each country. What are the universally desirable leadership attributes? And I was shocked to see this huge list. And so it seems like, now there will be cultural expressions to each of these, right? But basically, around the world, different cultures, they want leaders who are trustworthy. They want leaders who are decisive. They want leaders who are positive, which I found interesting, right? Everybody wants to follow somebody who's going to look for the best. They want someone who's honest, intelligent. As they made that list, they also looked for another list, and they looked for universally undesirable leadership traits. And they found these.
It's a shorter list.
It's a much shorter list. Yeah, it is a much shorter list. But basically, all the cultures around the world came back and said, we don't want to follow a loner. We don't want to follow someone who is irritable. Remember, if you're irritable, you're a high neurotic. Okay, to go back to the big 5. We don't want to follow someone who's ruthless. Someone who is asocial. Non-explicit, there's a lot there, don't worry about that. But that's basically someone who is vague. If you can't say, well, this is what we're going to do today, if you're going to say, well, sometime in the future we're going to do something and it's going to be great. Cultures don't really want to gravitate toward that. Dictatorial, non-cooperative, which I see those as the same. If you're a dictator, you're pretty much a bad cooperator. But that's just me. And egocentric, which, by the way, we'll talk about this next month. The fun thing about ego is everybody always thinks somebody else has it. So there's that. This idea of leader emergence. How is it that some people just bubble up to be leaders? The people who have studied this have looked at the list, and this is what they come back with. Those people tend to be extroverted. Okay? They tend to be extroverted because if you are someone who is really quiet, remember I'm a high I. So if I'm someone who just wants to sit at the table and just let others talk, I'm rarely, if ever, going to be considered a leader of that table, right? Because you're never going to be hurt. Someone who is socially intelligent, right? You can't just be loud and think you're going to be a leader. That seems like pretty basic stuff. You'd be amazed. Some people just think if I have the microphone, I'm the leader. No, if you have the microphone, you're loud. Okay? Leadership is something else. Social intelligence, agreeableness, someone who works well and plays well with others. Okay? This is what there's a story behind that laugh, and we just don't have time for it. But if you're going to bubble up as a leader, you have to work and play well with others. Emotionally stable, conscientious, someone who is decisive. And this is a really scary phrase, interpersonal dominance. Okay? That doesn't mean domineering, and it doesn't mean dictatorial. It means you don't mind your voice being the loudest. It means that in a conversation, at some point in the conversation, you're going to say, okay, even if you're a very collaborative leader, you're going to say, okay, this is what I'm hearing, and this is what I think we should do. At the point that you are someone who is comfortable saying, and this is what I think we should do, you are expressing some level of interpersonal dominance. Okay? So it's not as scary as it sounds, but it does sound scary. If you are going to emerge as a leader, two things that scientists have come back over and over and said you're not going to emerge as a leader is if you are perceived as manipulative, or, this is key, if you are perceived to be high on impression management, which means if people can see that you really care what people think, you are probably not going to emerge as a leader. Basically because you are trading on trust at that point, right? People in that group are saying, he doesn't really like me. He doesn't really like our group. He doesn't really want what's best for us. He just wants to be seen to be doing good things. So that's impression management. Now, okay, leadership versus personality, leadership, personality, whatever dynamic you want to talk about there. After hearing all of this, let's go back to that initial question. Born or bred? Leaders are born or built? What do you think?
Yes.
Even more so, right? Now after 2 hours, you're definitely somewhere smack in the middle.
You've convinced us we have no idea.
I've convinced you of nothing. Excellent. That's good leadership right there. Yes?
I think the opposite is true. I think you've convinced me more that they are built.
Okay. How so?
Well, there are a lot of things that feed into whoever you happen to be, right? Sure. Social things, cultural things, environmental things, experiential things. I was kind of going 50-50 when we started the conversation. I think I'm 25-75 at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, I think being a good leader is knowing where you're not.
Okay.
Being a good leader. We had a principal one time who was he was an extrovert, but he was not very good at administration. And what he did well was he shook hands and kissed babies. What he did not do well was manage HR or do anything else. And so the reason why he was a good leader was because he put those people in places to lead in those areas in which he could not.
Sure.
And they let him kiss babies and shake hands. And so that's where he led well, and then he led well by empowering other people to lead well, which is a built, not born.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I put the question up here, how can trait theory be misused? And I think there's potential for that, and we've talked about that. But when building teams, right, I think what you said is exactly right. There's value in knowing your personality and knowing what you don't do well. Even if your job description says, this is what you're ultimately responsible for, right? That's the time to go out and hire talent that's going to help you do that. Now, where that can be fraught with disaster, right, is when you say, well, I'm not a good numbers guy. I'm good at the people side of things, and so I'm never going to look at what the numbers say, right? Because at that point, you have crossed over to hiring good people to abdicating responsibility. So at that point, as a leader, you say, well, I'm not necessarily a good numbers guy. I've hired you to be my numbers guy. Please help me understand what the numbers mean so that I can do my job and lead this organization, right? Big difference between that and somebody who's just saying, well, I hired you to take care of that, right?
Because you can't delegate your accountability as the leader. And so when you cross that line, you cease to be the leader in that particular context.
Sure. Yeah.
So would you say a good phrase for that is delegate responsibility but not authority? How would you summarize that for someone?
Or accountability.
Yeah, I would use the word accountability. I mean, you can delegate responsibility, but you can't delegate accountability. Because at the end of the day, if you are designated as a leader, you know, the whole Truman phrase, the buck is going to stop with you. And so the people that I know who lead well according to their strengths and they hire or delegate out their weaknesses are the ones that at the end of the day still say, even though I hired this guy to do that, I'm responsible for him or her doing that thing. And so that's what I would say. Yes, someone else. The other thing that I'd like to kind of ask is, now we talked about social engineering in the first 5 minutes, which I thought was really interesting because this I planned for the very last question. The question then comes back of, all right, well, what are the traits that we want in our leaders? And it's a very personal question, right? Because your list is going to be informed by your personality, right? If you're an extrovert, you may not want to follow introverts, and that's okay. There's an argument there. I think you're wrong, but no, there's an argument there. Just kidding, mostly. Just kidding. Caught that, did you? Okay, so now it becomes a question of, all right, all of us are followers. We all follow somebody. So what is it that if you had the opportunity to kind of program a leader, what would you program them to be? And that can go back on us too, as we are deciding what kind of leaders, you know, God has made us to be and created us to be, you know, respect to context and situation. But what kind of leader do I want to be? And so I would this is kind of the last slide for today, is as you are thinking about this on your way home, think, what does an ideal leader look like? And there's no right or wrong answer. People have been arguing about this for as long as there have been people. But for your personality and for how you understand leadership, you know, what are the kinds of people that you like to follow? You know, what are the kinds of people that you want to attract as you are becoming a leader? All of that is a trait-based discussion. The last thing I want to do again is give you the date. It's October 25th for the next Leadership Cafe. If you have any other takeaways, I'm open to them, but I'm going to let you out a couple of minutes early. So you guys can go get lunch. But October 25th is the next Leadership Cafe. Some of you have signed up for that already. You don't need to sign up for it again. The video of last month is on the Leadership Cafe website. It's ubahouston.org/Leadership Cafe, or you could just go to the website. It's one of the menu items on the front page there. This video will be up near to when that one happens as well. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.